Hello, I'm Dan Heber, and this is the lecture video to accompany the readings for Immanuel Kant. And I'm going to be breaking down those readings into three corresponding lecture videos. The first of the lecture videos is this one, and it's titled, Kant and the Critical Problem, which is that's some terminology I'll explain in a moment. The second of the videos is pages this one's covering pages 338 to 342 of the reading assignment. The second of those videos is going to be covering pages 343 to 349 of the reading assignment. And in that video, I'm going to be explaining what is referred to as Kant's Copernican revolution and his theory of transcendental idealism. And the third video in this series is covering pages 351 to page 356 of the reading assignment. And in that video, I'm going to be covering Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena. So to get to what we're talking about for this video, section 6.5, we're looking at Kant as the sort of like the result of all of these philosophical ideas that we have talked about up to this point. Up to this point, we've talked about Plato, we talked about Descartes, we talked about Aristotle, we talked about Locke, we talked about Berkeley, we talked about Hume. And part of the challenge in understanding Immanuel Kant is that not only is he difficult in his own right, and he is quite difficult. He's the most difficult thinker that you're going to be exposed to during, at least in this class. Not only is Kant difficult in and of himself, an additional challenge that you have as a student is that before you can understand Kant, who is difficult, you have to have an understanding of Hume, who is also difficult. And before you can have an understanding of Hume, who is difficult, you have to have an understanding of Berkeley, who is difficult. And before you can have an understanding of Berkeley, who is difficult, you have to have an understanding of Locke. Before you can understand Locke, you have to understand, Aristotle. Before you understand, Aristotle, you have to have an understanding of Plato. So all of these, well, I left Descartes out of that equation, but you see my point here. All of these philosophical ideas that we've been talking about up to this point have been building on each other. And so in addition to Kant being difficult in his own right, part of the difficulty is that you have to understand everything else that we've talked about up to this point. So make sure that you understand everything that we've talked about up to this point before you get to Kant. You cannot hope to understand Kant without a good understanding of all of those previous ideas. So if you're not there yet, stop now, go back, refresh yourself of the information and the reading assignments, refresh yourself of the material in those previous lecture videos that I produced, as well as the additional required resources. So if you've done all that, if you have a good grasp of everything from Plato to Hume, now we can proceed. So just the title of section 6.5 here that John Chafee gave, we constitute our world. Immanuel Kant's theory is sometimes referred to as constructivism. What Immanuel Kant is going to say is that reality, as we perceive it, necessarily, is the result of a construction of our own mind. And because all reality is the result of how our mind constructs it, well, then that's what allows us to know it. So notice there I was using both terminology from the area that we refer to as metaphysics, the nature of reality, and I was also using vocabulary that speaks to epistemology. Immanuel Kant's theory of transcendental idealism is both. It is both a metaphysical theory, it's both a theory about what the nature of reality is, and it's also an epistemological theory, meaning that it's a theory about how we can know not just claims of knowledge, but how we can know what the nature of reality is itself. And so Kant's theory of transcendental idealism is doing both of those things in tandem. So like I've done in the past, whenever we talked about Plato's theory of the forms, which is both a metaphysical theory and an epistemological theory, I pointed out when we were dealing with an issue in epistemology and when we were dealing with a theory in metaphysics. During our conversation, our earlier conversation about Aristotle, particularly his analysis of the four causes and the doctrine of hylomorphism. It's both an epistemological theory and a metaphysical theory. And at that time, we emphasized when Aristotle was making an epistemological point versus when Aristotle was making a metaphysical point. I'm going to be doing the same thing at various times during these lecture videos. I'll point out whether the issue is epistemological or whether the issue is metaphysical. And what you should be doing is working on your ability to distinguish between those two things. Whenever you pick up a work of philosophy, you should be able to tell when the author is making an epistemological claim versus when the author is making a metaphysical claim. So we constitute our world. Our world, according to Immanuel Kant, is just the necessary result of how the mind constitutes or constructs it. Now that's his conclusion. What we're going to be spending our time on in these videos is how Immanuel Kant constructs an argument in support of that conclusion. And much of this opening work here is John Chafee just sort of setting the intellectual scene for Immanuel Kant. Now, Immanuel Kant, from our perspective, from students' perspective, it seems like a long time ago, right? Born in 18th century, in 1724, died in 1804. Seems like a long time ago from our perspective, but you have to remember how old a discipline philosophy actually is. These philosophical problems that Immanuel Kant was working on had already been around for 2,000 years and didn't have a satisfactory resolution. We've seen from this lineage that we've been addressing just in this brief introduction, from Plato to Hume up to this point. We've seen how philosophers have continually to be engaged in this question. It's like, well, how can I know things? What is the nature of reality? And we've seen that both in the rationalist tradition and in the empiricist tradition, that they both sort of dead end. Once Descartes in the rationalist tradition unleashes his evil demon, and that's language that Chafee is using in that green highlighted area, we can never really fully banish the idea of skepticism. Descartes tries, but of course we saw, reasons why Descartes ultimately wasn't successful in resolving this issue of skepticism. And we saw the same thing on the empiricist side of the spectrum, right? We saw, what we call the ontological skepticism of Berkeley, doubting the existence of physical things that inhabit a physical universe. And we saw an extreme version of that skepticism, epistemological skepticism, in David Hume, where David Hume's going to say that, you can't even know that the ground is going to be there to meet your foot the next time you take a step. And if you can't know such a basic thing as that, then everything else is also called into question, right? And so that's the scenario that Kant enters the scene here. And so what Kant is going to be attempting to do here is to answer all of these philosophical questions that philosophers have been grappling with for 2,000 years. And Kant sort of uses Hume as the entry point here. And here, whenever in this blue highlighted passage, Immanuel Kant says, however hasty and mistaken Hume's conclusion may appear. So he's expressing some disagreement with Hume there. So we have to review Hume. So remember Hume's analysis. And this is what's referred to in the philosophical literature as Hume and the critical problem. The critical problem that Hume lays out is, how is it possible to get from a present impression to a future idea? So what we mean by an impression, this pencil, I perceive it drop down. So that is something I actually perceived. So now the question is, well, just because every time I've picked up a pencil in the past and dropped it, how do we know, if at all, that that's going to continue like that in the future? And what Hume points out, after he made that distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact, what Hume points out is, well, it's certainly not a matter of fact that the pencil's going to drop the next time, fall to the ground the next time I drop it, because I haven't dropped it yet. I haven't observed it yet. So it's clearly not a matter of fact. But it's also not a relation of ideas, because there's nothing about the definition of the pencil that entails downward motion once I let it go. So what Hume concludes is that we can't know it. Now, remember what Hume says in addition to that. I can't help but believe that the pencil's going to drop on the basis of my psychological, framework here. It's just that I can't know it. So it's natural for me to believe it, because on the basis of all of my years of experience, anytime I ever have picked up a pencil and dropped it, it has fallen. But that's a psychological explanation, and that's as much as Hume's going to allow. Hume's going to say, yes, I can't help but believe that this pencil is going to fall down, but I can't know it. So that's what that's what Kant is going to be pushing back against. What Kant is going to say, no, we're not going to be following Hume in his conclusion. Kant just takes it as a given that, yes, clearly we can know things about the future. Clearly I know what's going to happen to this pencil. The question for Kant is how? How is it possible for me to know about something that hasn't happened yet, right? That's what he's going to be attempting to do. And let's see. Again, all of this highlighted material is just a review of David Hume and what we call the critical problem. See, again, according to Hume, we can't know it. Most we can say is that that we can't help but believe it, but we are going to be always lacking in that philosophical justification of those claims of knowledge. And this passage here, which I should have had highlighted already, but I didn't for some reason, so let me go ahead and highlight that now. So whenever it says, hence he inferred, that's Kant talking about Hume. Hence Hume inferred that reason was altogether deluded with reference to this concept, the concept of cause and effect, which she reason, Kant's using that pronoun she to refer to reason itself, which reason erroneously considered as one of her children. Whereas in reality, it was nothing but a bastard of imagination, very colorful language that Kant is using here, impregnated by experience, which subsumed certain representations under the law of association and mistook the subjective necessity of habit for an objective necessity arising from inset. So remember how we used Pavlov's dogs as a way of understanding what Hume has to say about causation. That we're just conditioned the way Pavlov's dogs were conditioned to accept certain things. So Pavlov's dogs, he rings a bell, he gives the dogs food, he rings the bell, he gives the dogs food. So from the dog's subjective necessity, right? From the dog's perspective, as it were, there's a connection between bell ringing and food giving. Of course, there is no logical connection between those two things, right? There's no necessary connection between the ringing of a bell and the giving of food. It's just that the dogs have been conditioned to make that association. Same thing with a human being. I am conditioned to believe that the ground is going to be there to meet my foot the next time I take a step, because that's the way it's always been in my experience. Anytime I ever have taken a step, the ground has always been there to meet my foot. But then we're making the same mistake that dogs are making whenever they start to salivate and get excited whenever they hear the ringing of a bell. That's the subjective habit, right? And we mistake that, according to Hume, for the objective necessity arising from insight. And so all of this is Kant agreeing with Hume here. So he agrees with Hume's analysis, but he disagrees with Hume's conclusion. So what we're going to be doing in the following lecture videos, well, what I'm going to be doing in the next two lecture videos, is sort of talking about how Kant sort of says, yes, Hume is right. Causation is not a truth of observation. We never observe a cause. We only observe a sequence of events. And also, Hume was right. Causation is not something true by definition. There's nothing about the definition of the pencil that entails downward motion once I drop it. So Kant agrees with Hume on both of those points. Now the question is, well, if you're agreeing with what a portion of Hume's argument, how are you going to be rejecting Hume's conclusion? Because Kant said very forcefully, right at the very beginning of this, that Hume's conclusion was hasty and mistaken. So Hume says we cannot have knowledge of causation. We cannot have knowledge of things that haven't happened yet. We can certainly have knowledge of things in the past because we've observed it. But we can't have knowledge of things that are going to be taking place in the future because reason doesn't help us and experience doesn't help us. And remember, for Hume, those are the only two modalities of knowledge. So I'm going to leave it, I'm going to stop right there, and in the next lecture video, I'm going to be picking up on page 343 of the text. Well, actually, technically speaking, the very bottom of page 342. But we're going to be emphasizing this section right here, transcendental idealism. So I'm going to go ahead and let you go for now, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.